Welcome, everyone. Welcome to week 2. We're going to actually get into some content here. This week, we're going to be discussing the history of education in America. This is really important, not only for our general edification about history, but also for understanding and contextualizing a lot of what we're going to talk about down the line. Everything from the role of civil rights in education to why the federal government doesn't do much about education and why they can't do much about education. So, really important stuff down the line. We are going to go ahead and get started here. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and discuss this article that I was scrolling through while the Ramones played their song here. So what this is discussing is the state of Oregon has started allowing non-binary students to identify as non-binary. Instead of marking M or F for male or female, they can mark X for non-binary. The problem they ran into is that, according to the Civil Rights Act, schools have to submit demographic data to the federal government every year. Federal government, however, does not have a submittal area for non-binary students. So, as it said in here, one of the assistant superintendent here said that she was contacted by the federal government and was told to take these non-binary students and decide whether or not they fall into male or female. And obviously that presents a problem, right? Really, what I want you to get from this, and this article I will share on Canvas, what I really want you to get from this is this idea. Look at how disparate something as simple as collecting a student's gender information is. We've got states like New York, Virginia, New Mexico that collect and don't disclose what students' gender data is, and then you've got states that collect and disclose to the federal government, like Washington. This is really important for not only these students to be represented as they discussed here, but for us to have a true understanding of what the impact of education is on non-binary students. Something, as we discuss history of education, and we go through these different places that education takes us. When we discuss civil rights, a lot of people believe, and I tend to agree with them, that this non-binary LGBTQ plus students are the net civil rights push here. So let me go ahead and get our presentation pulled up for this week. Wonderful. All right, let's get started here. So, we're going to talk about the history of education and American education policy. We're going to run through I'm going to categorize it into 4 different buckets. The way people talk about education history varies. I'm going to break it into early common schools, comprehensive schools, the civil rights movement, and then contemporary school policy. For this presentation exclusively, all you need to read is that CEP History of Public Education document at the top of our Unit 1 in Canvas, and then be prepared for our Friedman and Levin response. There will be a separate presentation, our first presentation on federal education policy, that will have you discuss Friedman and Levin, we'll discuss in greater detail the Friedman and Levin debate. So let's start with the common school movement. So this is education before 1900. This is when education really was not a thing. So make sure you've read the CEP document at this point. It's really important so that you kind of know where I'm going with this, right? First and foremost, theme we're going to see this entire time. Public education is not a constitutional right. Education, especially in early America, was for the wealthy and pious and white, obviously. Most schools were privately owned. They're exclusive. They're religious. They were mainly for wealthy kids to receive a specific training to become a religious leader, a political leader, and a business owner, something like that. when the Constitution was written, education was not mentioned. That really rubbed Thomas Jefferson and John Adams the wrong way. They said, hey, education is really important to this democracy we're trying to build. They wanted a universal education system funded by the federal government. Obviously, that didn't happen. They were largely rejected. There wasn't even a plurality of founding fathers who believed in something like this. That being said, the federal government early on did take small steps, like rewarding states that created their new constitutions with federal funding for educational institutions if they did include education in their state constitutions. But this fear of a centralized government really prevented them from creating any sort of nationalized government here. One of the earliest attempts to create a state-financed education system was the bill for establishing a system of public education in 1817 in the Virginia House of Delegates. This was for establishing schools at which the children of all the citizens of this Commonwealth may receive a primary grade of education at the common expense. Really cool, right? Again, remember, this was for white boys. That's basically all it was still. But it's good to see that states early on were seeing this as a public enterprise, as something that everyone should be paying into, that we all had a common interest in making sure our citizenry were educated. Early on, because the federal government chose not to do anything, this burden fell on the states. The economy hadn't evolved, and school was pretty unnecessary for a lot of people. Poor working and rural families actually saw school as an impediment to the success and survival of their families. They needed children to work the farm. They needed to work the land. And no states really, because of this, no states really adopted large centralized education systems. And what happened then was early public education fell to communities. This meant that the spread of education was incredibly unequitable. If we think about this, right, when rural, poor, working families were the ones that couldn't practically support education, which communities then were the ones that would support an education system? We had wealthy communities, we had pious communities, we had urban communities, and we had communities that were connected largely to the European world. So this basically centralized everything in the Northeast. One thing that this did do, though, was create a system of local community control, a tradition of local community control over schools that we still experience to this day. The way that schools would be set up in this early time was that communities would create schools where one resident would donate property, and then parents would band together and either teach classes themselves or hire out a foreign educator from Europe to come in and teach their students. There was no oversight mechanism really other than what the parents saw, but this was something that individual parents banded together and said, we want education for our kids. That was really all education was really early on. Then Horace Mann came about. Horace Mann is the father of American education. I think that is indisputable. He had problems, but he is the one who said, you know what? Education is important. We should all care about it as a public good. Horace Mann was a state legislator from Massachusetts who created the Massachusetts State Board of Education. It was the first state board of education ever created. He later ran that state board that he created. Horace Mann was very famous. He had a lot of experience seeing European schools. And what he did was he created a compendium of Massachusetts schools by riding his horse from school to school to school all across Massachusetts, categorizing and documenting what these community schools looked like. The size and location of the building, the types of seats the students sat on was also part of it. Horace Mann was very concerned about making sure that students had good posture. Many were just sitting on wooden benches that he felt were detrimental to their experiences. He wanted to make sure that they had a library and that there was a good selection of books in the library. He also was categorizing the general cleanliness and pleasantness of the classroom. A lot of classrooms were dank and dark and not pleasant to be around, and this was all stuff that Mann saw as an impediment to kids wanting to go to school and parents wanting to send them there. So he took this knowledge, he took this compendium, the early Bible of Massachusetts education, and he said, we need schools for the common folk. We need common schools. We have a collective interest in education for future generations. He took Thomas Jefferson and John Adams' arguments and evolved it. And he said that not only was it important for democracy, but it was important for political, economic, and moral health of America. This kind of gets to what we talked about last week with Laborie. Mann set out this understanding that education was not just something that we, as a democratic institution, should care about. He said that our politics, our economy, and our society overall were dependent on the quality of our education. This is something that really rang true today. Mann, because of this, he also said that common schools should be taught with a religious tradition, with an emphasis on what for a long time were called the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. This was something that Mann brought to these common school movements and really found a lot of traction early on, especially in his state of Massachusetts. Horace Mann may have set down the foundation of what we think of as education, but Catherine Beecher is the one that made education its own sector and its own experience overall. Catherine Beecher, if Horace Mann is the father of education, Catherine Beecher is the mother of teaching. One problem that Catherine Beecher said was she looked at Horace Mann's arguments and she said, great, I'm glad someone's talking about schools. But Horace Mann also only talked about schools for boys. He didn't really have a place for girls in these schools, and Catherine Beecher took problem with that. And he said that Horace Mann's common schools not only excluded girls, but they mistreated them. Beecher overhauled many seminary schools to further women's rights and female access to education because she had the power to go into these schools and say, hey, this is what we need. To meet this moral obligation we have, we need to make sure that girls are equally educated to boys. Not only did she do a lot for early gender equality in the classroom, but Beecher is probably most importantly known as the lightning rod for professionalizing teaching. Remember what I said about early community schools? They were often either taught by parents who joined together, mostly mothers, or they hired out foreign educators. The reason why they would hire out foreign educators is that no one really knew how to teach. It was something that wasn't thought about. It wasn't considered early on. Catherine Beecher said we need to do like Europe does. We need to have a capacity and a system for training teachers, because if we have untrained people teaching our next generation, then our next generation is going to be untrained. Beecher pushed for what were called normal schools at universities. They were designed to promote teacher preparation and competence. A lot of universities adopted these normal schools. The most famous one in Colorado is UNC Greeley. Greeley's program, to this day, their education program is based off of Catherine Beecher's normal school philosophy. This professionalized system came into play really importantly as we start talking about the role of education as it becomes more widespread. Now, early American education, there's obviously goods and there's bads. The good is that it increased access to education. The common school movement really allowed more people to see school as acceptable for them to say, you know what, maybe for a few days we can allow our kids to go to school instead of working the farm. It also set the norm of schooling for many students, especially in the Northeast. It went from something I take advantage of, or I take for granted, is that, I went to school for the first 18 years of my life. I knew I was going to school. That was not always the case, especially in early America. This started setting out that norm that kids expected to go to school certain periods of the year, that parents wanted their kids to go to school. It created a cultural relevance to it. And then, this obviously set that modern basis for our education system, that tradition of local control, the moral, political, and economic imperative for education, all was set by this. There was obviously problems still. These poor school conditions that Mann noted in his journeys really had an impact on a lot of students, and because the quality of the school depended on the generosity of generally one wealthy landowner, poor communities were at a disadvantage. Mann's common schools as well were used to teach morality. He really focused on that, and that led to racism, religious discrimination, and exploitation. And like we're going to talk about in a second, it really set this norm of using schools to impart white traditional religious values on everyone in society. You know, again, we're going to see a lot of problems through our American education history, but just to take a look at what's going on here. Schoolhouses were donated by wealthier families, and they were generally centralized in town. Most supplies were donated. It was based off of the generosity of others. Most of the time, traditional 9.5-month school years were uncommon. Many schools had to work around planting and harvesting seasons. We had to make sure that kids were able to go harvest, to go help plant in the spring, harvest in the fall. But schools were cropping up. It was popular. 1897, Bellevue, Colorado, you can see here. They were open about 7 to 8 weeks a year. Economic needs because of the farms, poor transportation and weather prevented kids from getting to these schools. That we didn't really have a system of nice paved roads and sidewalks for kids to get there. There was no busing at this time, right? So, again, it was just a community experience that everyone kind of collectively bought into. Before I go, I want to give a trigger warning here. This is something I feel like is really important. And so if you are sensitive to physical, sexual, emotional abuse, especially towards BIPOC, people of color, and this will be specifically talking about Native Americans, please be aware as we discuss, but this is really important as we talk about the history of American education. We talked about transportation. Transportation played a huge role in how accessible education was. In urban settings, education was easy. Students could walk a few blocks, at most a half a mile, get to school, and they often didn't have as many obligations. But as America spread west and its education followed, it was a lot harder. People lived a lot further away from their neighbors. There was no convenient centralized location for a school to be located in. Schools in rural and undeveloped western and southern communities maybe were open a few weeks a year and were often unable to be staffed by competent educators. So whereas New England schools could hire out European teachers or could maybe hire a teacher from one of these new normal schools, these poorer rural areas, it was hard to get teachers out there. The solution, because it was all community controlled, the solution was that wealthier landowners said, okay, what we'll do is we're going to create schools that keep students year round. We call them boarding schools. They could live here, that way transportation wouldn't be an issue. Here's our problem. Oh no, it's cut off. Okay, well, I'll fix it to post it online. Native American boarding schools. Western expansion displaced a lot of Native people, and it created practical issues for the federal and state governments, right? What do we do with these Native Americans that we're displacing? Well, some leaders, like Richard Henry Pratt, argued that we should assimilate Native American peoples into American society. Let me see if I can fix this real quick. Hold on. Yeah, there we go. They said, okay, well, we're displacing them. We might as well just make them part of our new American way of life, right? Pratt was not benevolently motivated, though. He said that Native American cultures were barbaric and that schools could be a way for us to remove the barbarity from their culture. Pratt famously pitched these boarding schools as a way to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. I wish I could tell you that Pratt's ideas were roundly rejected. In fact, it's the exact opposite. The federal government, despite their limited roles, started offering federal funding through the form of grants for Native American boarding schools because the federal government saw a national interest in the assimilation of Native Americans into U.S. culture. The first school like this was created in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it piloted what was later called the Carlisle model for Native American assimilation. These Carlisle schools became rampant because of the federal spending on it, because of the popularity of it. It was seen as an easy solution to the native problem that many states were having. By 1900, over 300 Carlisle schools existed across America. These schools, because they were boarding schools that spent year-round, little oversight, they were rife with abuse and contributed to cultural genocide. Schools deprived students of their language, culture, and communication with family. It was relatively simple for these schools to just take these students in and essentially cut them off from their cultures. Before I move on, I do want to go back, and I want to touch a little bit more on this last topic right here. So these schools, because they were boarding schools, their logic was that we keep students year round, we teach them English, we teach them American ways of life without allowing them contact. They lost the use of their native language. Therefore, by the time they would get back and see their families, see their communities, they would be unable to communicate with their families altogether. It was a way to literally kill off Native American culture. The reason why I talked about this, and the reason why this is important for us to understand, is that schools as cultural genocide is not even an uncommon, it's actually relatively common when you look at the way that schools are manipulated and used to promote specific Anglo-Saxon white values. These schools, to this day, the idea of banning books that teach a racially diverse history of America are cutting off certain students from understanding the history of potentially their culture. And this is a trend we see a lot because education is decentralized, because it does allow communities to essentially do what they want. It is really hard for us to promote this, national centralized education system. Super bummer. Sorry. A lot of education history is a bummer, though. And so, as we would say, the arc of history does bend towards justice. And so, Native American boarding schools did eventually stop, but it took way longer, well into the 1940s for them to fully end. So, anyway, moving on. Common schools spread across the West. How exciting. But there were other challenges that were starting to present themselves that ran concurrently with this spread of education. Immigration was huge. The influx of immigrants into America dramatically increased the number of families needing schooling for their children, as did the emancipation of African Americans in the late 1800s. These community populations were growing rapidly, especially in cities. Many turned to schools to learn English because they did want to assimilate. They were fleeing famine, they were fleeing war, and so they wanted to learn English and try to fit in with their communities. But because these schools were still community ran, no real oversight from federal or state governments, discrimination ran rampant. African American communities were forced to form their own schools separate from white students, and immigrants were often discriminated against as well. Like I talked about before, though, there was a growing expectation that kids go to school. Schools weren't new anymore at this point. Students who were the first in their families to even attend a common school at all, now had kids and grandkids that they expected to go to school. Because of this expectation and the promise of education in a lot of state constitutions, states said, okay, we need to create some sort of system to help oversee this. So they fell in line with Massachusetts at Horace Mann and created state boards of education. By 1870, all 37 states that existed at that point had free primary elementary schools. Whether or not they were discriminatory, different conversation, but they were free and they were accessible to most people. There's some other considerations, other things that help promote the spread of education at this point. So the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890 are called the Land Grant Acts. If you if you know anything about the history of CSU as an institution, CSU is a land grant school. This allowed for the creation of land grant universities in most states, and all of these schools were required to admit students regardless of their race. Obviously, there were other problems if children of color were not receiving an education that allowed them to have the experience and educational skills necessary to attend these schools, then they could not be accepted. But a lot of these schools were focused on agriculture, mining, technology, and this was a huge deal, and it allowed for that upward mobility for a lot of students. Common school laws across a lot of states occurred. Many states latched on to these man reforms and passed laws that created common schools, created funding for common schools. They standardized age-based education, making sure that four-year-olds are in this age, are in this grade, 5-year-olds are in this grade, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of them implemented compulsory attendance, making this made sure that if students weren't attending school, there would be consequences. That their parents could be fined, they could get in trouble legally. And then there's a lot of them that required tuition-free K through 12. And this was where we see the growth of what we would commonly refer to as public schools occur. Now, again, we're talking about this spread, incredibly fragmented still at this point. Pennsylvania, way back in 1790, allowed or required free K through 12. Whether or not the schools existed, different problem, but they did do this. States adopted education clauses into their constitutions at differing rates. Colorado, when they were created as a state, had an education clause from the beginning. Other states took a while and later had to amend their constitution to include an education clause. To this day, every state has a provision for free public education, but they chose that. That wasn't required by the U.S. Constitution. In fact, it's important to say that the courts have never even said that the Constitution grants Congress the ability to create education laws. Congress will pass any education law as what we would call a tax and spend law, because that is what they are allowed to do under the Constitution. So when we talk about the Carlisle schools, for example, they funded Carlisle schools through grants, and that was a way for them to say, as a policy, we want this outcome. But because we can't say we create Carlisle schools and manage them at a federal level, instead they just offered funding for the creation of those schools. A really important trend that continues to this day. Fragmentation became untenable. It was awful. Graduation rates were increasing. Enrollment rates exploded. Schools couldn't keep up with the growth. So at this point, people started to ask, wait, hold on. Why are kids going to school? I don't know if we've talked about that at this point. We've got this moral imperative, this economic and political imperative. What's the purpose? So a bunch of rich white dudes got together, and they started talking. The first was the 1892 Committee of 10 report. In this report, elite higher education professionals, as part of the National Education Association, elected a group of 10 of their members to review the uniformity of high school graduation requirements. This committee issued a report called the Committee of 10 report, which is one of your assigned readings for this section, called for a singular curriculum that prepares every individual for college attendance. Charles Eliot, who was the chair of the Committee of 10, believed, quote, that high schools fulfilled the promise of equal opportunity for education by insisting that all students take the same types of rigorous academic courses. Differentiation of curriculum to the committee was lessening the quality of education. This was discrimination to them. They wanted high-quality liberal arts high school curriculums that prepared every student for college. This report was a massive deal. A lot of education professionals latched onto this and started reforming their high school curriculums to be this unified, singular curriculum that was challenging and promoted everyone going to college. Not everyone agreed with it, though. Another group from another committee from the National Education Association issued a separate report in 1918 called The Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education, also a required reading. Higher education was not the end goal for this report. They said that by having one unifying curriculum, it would force inferior students out of school. It would say that, these students who are not able to keep up with this rigorous curriculum would just leave, and it would actually lead to more discrimination. They called for what is called curricular differentiation. It prepares students based on their needs and skills, whether it was whether they were headed towards college, whether they were heading towards a technical or a trade school, or whether they were this was going to be a terminal moment for them. They were going to get their high school diploma and enter the workforce. Promoting this idea led to the creation of what we would call a comprehensive high school. Comprehensive high schools, to this day, are the models for most American public high schools. This offered a wide variety of courses to meet students where they are. These two competing principles were really important for our growth in the growth and expansion of public education. The cardinal principles argument obviously won because comprehensive schools are still the model to this day. From the 1920s on, almost all American high schools were comprehensive high schools. Early comprehensive high schools had one problem, though. How do we tell whether or not students are headed for college or headed for a technical school? They said, okay, what we need is some sort of system, some sort of staff member that can help test this. And so that is why high schools early on had school counseling programs. Counselors were responsible for matching students to their tracks to meet their needs and abilities. If you're reading ahead of me, you're obviously seeing where this is going. Counselors were to administer IQ tests. IQ tests determine the student's overall intellectual ability. Famously, IQ tests cannot change. Your IQ cannot change according to these tests. Wherever you test in 4th grade is your IQ forever on. And then they would be scientifically matched because of their IQ result to the appropriate tracks. These different tracks were either academic, which was the Committee of Tens model. They didn't completely get rid of this rigorous liberal arts education. A commercial work. This was the women's track, that if you were a competent girl who had a high IQ score, they would be put into this commercial office work, or they would learn things like shorthand and secretarial work. Vocational, which was industry and home ec skills. So this was either preparing them to go to a vocational school or go into a trade or become a homemaker. Or the general no specific preparation. We want these kids to get a high school diploma, and that's about it. In 1928, these non-academic courses accounted for about 33% of all courses taken. By 1961, it was up to 43%. This was largely based on a belief amongst a lot of education professionals that only 20% of students were skilled enough to master academic content. Therefore, why would we put them and challenge them in academic courses? Instead, we're going to put them in less rigorous courses like health and home ec and PE. By the 1950s, enrollment still increasing. Graduation rates massively increased because of this. We were tracking students, and a lot of students were put into easier tracks, therefore making it easier for them to graduate. And you would have professionals at this point talking about how high school was less rigorous and therefore more equal and better for everyone. This style of education obviously had larger problems, and that hadn't quite come to a head yet because of this, right? Comprehensive schools failed poor minority students. Intellectual ability IQ tests are incredibly racist. They are based off of this presumption that people are from birth better than others. Studies of Detroit in 1961 found that the poorest students, who were largely minorities, were 8 times more likely to be taken out of rigorous academic tracks and put into those general and vocational tracks. But because we set the standard that what we were going to measure the success of the high school by was graduation rate, there wasn't really any interest from school professionals to adjust this comprehensive model. Schools continue to be segregated. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 was a huge court case at that time that supported the separate but equal doctrine. This isn't a law course, but you should know Plessy v. Ferguson. It said that public services can be separated by race and still be considered equal. Therefore, schools were allowed to be separated by race and still provide what they would call equal education. White schools receive more funding, more resources, and much more likely to support rigorous academic courses than minority schools. Because we started tying funding to the success of these high schools, to the graduation rates. Poorer schools were incentivized to lower the rigor of their courses. This was a vicious cycle that not only perpetuated this massive divide in rigorous versus non-rigorous education, but also perpetuated a massive divide between white and minority students. So they decided to do something about it. So NAACP, civil rights activists, came up with a plan, and they supported a man named Oliver Brown, who attempted to enroll his daughter in an all-white elementary school in Topeka, Kansas. He was obviously denied based off of his daughter's race, and they said, you have a school for African-American children, you can go there. Brown said no. Absolutely not. That's not how this works. And he and his lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, sued on the basis that segregated schools did not provide equal education, and it violated the 14th Amendment's promise to equal protection under the law. This was a huge deal. They directly challenged the Plessy v. Ferguson decision and said, we want the Supreme Court to look at this. And in 1954, the Supreme Court agreed. Chief Justice Warren wrote in a unanimous decision that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. It killed segregation, de jure segregation in school, the legal segregation of schools. Many schools voluntarily complied and began to desegregate their schools and allow students to apply for whatever school they want. Some resisted. Many schools resisted. And a lot of schools being integrated were subject to violent protests. So, in a heretofore, as far as I know, unprecedented decision, the Supreme Court issued another ruling in the same case that we would call Brown 2, that required school integration to occur with all deliberate speed. This was insane. This was a direct challenge to the court's authority. There was a Andrew Jackson-esque argument from many Southern governors that said the Supreme Court can tell us what to do when they march in their army and tell us what to do. So the court issued another ruling and essentially challenged the executive branch to enforce this. Violence continued, and President Eisenhower ordered federal forces to enforce desegregation of schools in a lot of southern schools, perhaps most famously in Little Rock, Arkansas. Following this decision, following this massive upheaval in education, federal education flourished. The influx of pro-civil rights lawmakers in Congress, as well as this newly found power to enforce civil rights at a federal level, Congress and the president began passing massively important federal laws. We're going to talk in detail about a lot of these, but I'm going to run through a couple of them that I want you to know are important. So the ESEA is perhaps the most important one of these, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This was part of the Great Society and War on Poverty initiative. This set the federal government's standards for funding education. It was a focus on minimizing the achievement gap, making sure that poorer schools could achieve at the same level as wealthier schools. They wanted the improved performance of underachieving schools and addressed racial disparities that still persisted. It served as the basis for many federal future education policies. It also created Title I schools, which you may have heard of. Title I schools are schools with a high percentage of low-income students, and it helped distribute resources to those schools, such as the free and reduced lunch program. There were other ones like the Bilingual Education Act that formalized that schools must accommodate English language learners and English second language students. Another big one, we haven't talked about the importance of gender equality in schools. In the Civil Rights Amendments of 1972, Title IX was created, and this prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in ed programs that receive federal funding, which, thanks to the EA, were all of them pretty much, every public school. This had a massive impact on schools, but it also had a massive impact on youth and college sports programs because they were considered part of the education system. They could no longer discriminate against girls in those sports programs. Because of this massive growth of regulations and funding that the federal government had to distribute, the Department of Education was created. It was held within the Department of the Interior for a little while, and they said, no, we need our own thing. And so in 1980, President Carter created the Department of Education. Another important one, we've talked about racial equality, gender equality, the IDEA law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was passed by George H.W. Bush in 1990, worked in tandem with the Americans with Disabilities Act to improve access of education with people with disabilities to receive specialized support. This was when we saw the massive spread of special education programs. And the courts didn't stop their work at this point because Brown became this historic, monumental a keystone moment for courts. They said, we need to support this. So they started stepping in and saying that these districts that were refusing to integrate their schools and refusing to comply, that was not going to fly with them. For example, in Keyes versus School District Number 1 in 1974, Denver Public Schools, which at that point were taking certain parts of their community and splitting them up to say, these ones in the south part of Denver would be integrated, but, these are the wealthier kids. They're allowed to stay up there. They challenged that in court and won. And they said Denver Public Schools had to create a mandatory busing program to desegregate all of their schools. They were not allowed to continue this partial desegregation. There was a lot of protests. There was violence. There was burning of bus depots in the city of Denver in the 1970s. My grandfather was part of some forced busing programs in Denver at the time, and he recalls to me these violent protests. These white parents who would throw things at school buses driving past with an integrated group of students on board. This happened across the country. It was a huge deal, but the courts took this imperative and said, this is not going to fly. Equal education means equal education. We cannot have pockets of segregation by law existing anywhere. So here we are. We're caught up to contemporary education policy. This sort of stuff I want you guys to make sure you're noting, and we're going to talk about it a bunch in the next presentation and next week, where we talk about A Nation at Risk, No Child Left Behind, and Every Student Succeeds. So at this point, go read A Nation at Risk. This is, with Cardinal Principles and Committee of 10, the most important education policy document that isn't a law or court ruling ever created. So, remember, Department of Education created in 1980. Therefore, President Reagan stepped in, won this landslide victory in 1980, and said, you know what? I'm concerned. I'm worried about the quality of our education because it has become this national system. He called on the Department of Education to impanel a commission to study how well our public education system is preparing students to compete in the global economy. This was spurred by, among other things, the launch of the Sputnik space telescope, or space satellite. This was scary for a lot of Americans who had felt that we just lost the space race. And a lot, including President Reagan, connected that with a poor education system. So, Department of Education impaneled an 18-member Commission on Excellence in Education to study our education system, and they reported out the following. Our nation is at risk. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world. We report to the American people that while we can take justifiable pride in what our schools and colleges have historically accomplished and contributed to the United States and the well-being of its people, The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. This 1983 report, A Nation at Risk: The Imperative for Education Reform, became massively important. This was a terrifying report for a lot of people to hear. The rising tide of mediocrity gave every lawmaker who pushed for education reform the basis to create new policies. It opened that policy window for them. It created salience on the issue. It gave them a political opening to create those policies. This report came with startling statistics. 23 million Americans, even though our rising graduation rates, were functionally illiterate. Standardized test scores, such as the SAT, plummeted compared to others. And overall, since the start of the Cold War in the 1960s, there was a decrease, a continued decrease in the standardized test scores. I don't want to spell it out for you all too much. You're all intelligent. But keep in mind what the Committee of 10 report argued and what the Cardinal Principles report argued. This conversation between the role of rigor in our high schools and then what 80 years later, the Commission on Excellence in Education reported that this rising tide of mediocrity had actually undermined the goal of education, especially with its economic imperative. It didn't call for specific policy changes. It was not a policy document. It was an issue document. It was a political document. They did issue some recommendations that education be focused on excellence as opposed to meeting that minimum requirement, as opposed to pushing students out the door with their high school diploma. They wanted teachers to be better trained. They wanted tests to be more rigorous, and they wanted graduation requirements to be better suited to prepare our students to compete in the global economy. States responded. They heeded this call and began individual reform efforts that implemented new performance measures for students and for teachers. It tied state school funding more closely to school performance, especially when it came to standardized test scores, and created more systems to turn around failing schools. There was also an increased focus on competitive scientific programs, such as STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, because there was concern that we were falling behind, especially in that realm during the Cold War. There was increased and renewed focuses on these STEM programs. That all happened at the state level. For the most part, there wasn't any massive national change until George W. Bush. Now, recent political history, you may not know that the reason George W. Bush won the White House in 2000 was he ran on education. He was the education president. Reagan, Bush, and Clinton all started to more centralize education to their vision. And then George W. Bush said, I'm going to go beyond that. I'm going to actually make policy changes in education central to my campaign, what I will promise to do as president. And in January 2002, President Bush signed in the most important education legislation nationwide since the ESEA, the No Child Left Behind Act. NCLB, No Child Left Behind, fulfilled this promise, and it ended what he called, quote, the soft bigotry of low expectations, really echoing that rising tide of mediocrity language, but connecting it to the civil rights pushes that happened. It created a system of regulations that took the ESEA and that system of funding and more closely tied it to requirements that the state do things before they receive federal funding. It requires states to do the following: to administer yearly standardized tests of student proficiency in key areas, especially reading and arithmetic and science. It required states to create systems to properly certify and train teachers, and to create sanctioned programs to correct and take over low-performing schools. It nationalized these standards. Now, again, remember, the federal government cannot create education policy. This was all tax and spend policy. So it wasn't saying, we need you to do this. We're just saying, if you want to receive our funding, you have to do this, which is a loophole, but it is a loophole that the courts have regularly accepted. No Child Left Behind was initially incredibly popular. This influx of comparable student performance data was incredibly important for us to be able to say, hey, this student's doing well and this student isn't doing well. It improved test scores among minority students. There was data now to show that post No Child Left Behind, minority students were performing better on these standardized tests. And whether they liked it or not, if they wanted to continue to receive education funding from the federal government, which they did, all states had to take on education reform. But it's not saying that this was universally accepted as a good policy. Some called the No Child Left Behind programs unfunded mandates. This is a huge theme. They're saying to receive these fundings, you must create systems that will cost states money to receive this funding. That is what we would call an unfunded mandate. Many politicians and policymakers are against unfunded mandates. But it changed workloads. It created regulatory mechanisms that the states had to pay for, and the federal funding was not going towards those mechanisms. It was just connected to schools still. It also took these standardized tests that were already coming around, especially post A Nation at Risk, as the standard way for us to review school performance, and formalized that every public school would be centered around testing programs. And there was an incentive now for teachers to, quote, teach to the test. If their entire performance, if their entire success as an educator centered on students succeeding on this one test, there is an incentive for schools to teach students how to do well on that test. This also left less empirical quantitative fields like history, social science, and arts to be neglected. It led to the decline in a lot of performing arts programs nationwide. Despite the positive and negatives, I would argue that it is the most important education policy and that we've seen in a while, and every other policy we see at a state, federal, or local level is in some way connected and tied directly to No Child Left Behind. Now, this is something that we're going to talk about a lot when we get into the actual policy discussion, but No Child Left Behind's mandates became popular. Sophisticated regulatory mechanisms at the state level became incredibly commonplace. And individual states nibbled at the margins, attempting to adjust the requirements, especially if they had a large population of rural schools, if they needed specific teacher preparation programs, if they had many students who didn't speak English as their native language. They nibbled away at the changes, but this focus on testing really became unpopular, and public sentiment quickly turned against No Child Left Behind. Like I said, it was incredibly popular to start, but there wasn't really a national imperative to adjust, to change. But when public sentiment turned against it, it created an opening. It created the proper conditions for someone to step in and make changes. President Obama did that in 2015, creating the Every Student Succeeds Act, which overhauled many key elements of No Child Left Behind, including more flexible standardized testing. Since the Every Student Succeeds Act, we're still pretty close to that, so it's hard to see what the larger ramifications of that are going to be, because it did just reinforce the idea that standardized testing is the way that we measure student success. There's not really any belief that that's going anywhere anytime soon, but post-2015 hasn't really been a national push at the federal level for any new changes. But from there, because of many things, including President Trump's term in office, the coronavirus pandemic, and this lack of incentive for the federal level to do anything, a lot of focus has turned towards local school boards. There's been a lot of demagoguery about what they would call critical race theory, and increased calls for parental control over curriculum, like we discussed last week. More concern over gender-affirming student treatment. There's been a lot of legal discussion over whether or not Title IX is connected directly to gender identity. As of now, and I say that speaking in May 2022, as of now, courts have generally affirmed that Title IX protects students based on their sexual identity and gender identity. That being said, that does not mean that that will hold, and there is a lot of concern right now, especially with recent developments at the Supreme Court, that such a connection may not hold. And there's been a lack of federal direction since the SEA. Federal government really hasn't done much to provide direction to states on what they want standardized testing to look like. States drive the school performance. They continue to drive with No Child Left Behind's requirements, but since every student succeeds, there haven't been any other changes. So here we are. We have now full sprinted through the history of public education. There is another presentation this week. It is our first week of federal education policy. I would normally split this up, but because we're condensed for the summer, I want to make sure that you're receiving everything that I need to give you to fully understand this topic. So please go on to watch week 2. We will discuss the basis of a lot of federal education policy. We're going to discuss rational choice theory. We're going to discuss Friedman and Levin, which is directly connected to your reading response, due this Friday. And then we're do a little bit of a case study on charter schools to set up a lot of the discussion that happens in our text, our Sam Abrams text. So I want to thank you guys for taking the class. I'm super stoked to continue. I'm really excited to actually dig into some of this hard policy stuff, and I promise that eventually it won't just be info dumps. It'll be a more intellectual discussion, but we really need to get this basis out there. There's not really a lot of focus on education in history curriculums, and so I want to make sure that you guys had that basis. You understood common schools, you understood boarding schools, you understood the Committee of 10 and cardinal principles, especially since there will be reading responses connected to those later on. So thank you guys. Move on to the next week 2 presentation, and I will talk to you soon.